The interior of the C-130 Hercules smelled like hydraulic fluid, stale sweat, and the metallic tang of unspoken prayers. The red jump light bathed the cargo hold in a hellish, crimson glow, turning the faces of the 30 men of the 82nd Airborne around me into skeletal masks of anticipation. My heart wasn't just beating, it was hammering against my ribs like a prisoner trying to riot. A chaotic rhythm syncing with the vibrating roar of the turboprops outside. I adjusted the strap of my M4 carbine, feeling the cold familiarity of the polymer against my chest rig, checking my reserves for the 10th time. 6 mags of 5.56 green tip. A Glock 19 on my hip. A tactical tomahawk strapped to my pack. It felt heavy, grounded, the only reality in a world that had dissolved into madness 72 hours ago. The Jump Master, a grizzly sergeant first class named Miller who looked like he chewed concertina wire for breakfast, stood by the open ramp, the wind whipping his headset cord violently. Below us, through the gaping maw of the aircraft's rear, lay the objective. Washington, D.C. The beating heart of the American dream, now flatlining. From 20,000 feet. It didn't look like the postcard capital I'd visited on an 8th grade field trip. It looked like a grid of burning embers. Thick, oily plumes of black smoke choked the skyline, blotting out the Potomac, rising from the shattered remains of democracy. The grid. The darkness was absolute in sectors, punctuated only by the flickering orange agony of uncontrolled structure fires. We weren't dropping into a hot zone. We were dropping into a graveyard that hadn't figured out it was dead yet. 1 minute! Miller screamed over the comms, his voice cutting through the mechanical din. The line of troopers stood up, a collective shifting of 80-pound rucksacks, the sound of nylon rubbing on canvas filling the hold. I hooked my static line, the snap link clicking onto the cable with a sound that felt final. The guy in front of me, a kid named Kowalski from rural Ohio who used to talk non-stop about his dad's Ford dealership, was shaking. Not the adrenaline shake. The fear shake. The kind that rattles your teeth. I put a gloved hand on his shoulder, squeezing the deltoid hard enough to bruise. "Lock it in, Ski!" I shouted over the wind. "Just like Bragg. Just like practice." He nodded, but I couldn't see his eyes behind the ballistic goggles. I wondered if he knew we were dropping into a meat grinder. The intel briefing had been sparse, redacted, and terrified. Civil unrest was the euphemism. Biological containment breach was the lie. We knew the truth. We'd seen the live streams before the internet went dark. We saw the suburban malls in Florida overrun, the interstates in Texas turned into parking lots of carnage, the faces of neighbors tearing into neighbors. The United States of America was cannibalizing itself, and we were the antibodies injected too late to cure the disease, sent only to salvage the blackened organs. Green light! Go! 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 The shout was primal. The lines surged forward. The shuffle of combat boots on the metal deck plates was a drumbeat of war. Kowalski disappeared into the howling void. Then it was my turn. I stepped into the nothingness, the slipstream hitting me like a physical blow, ripping the breath from my lungs. The roar of the engines vanished, replaced by the violent rushing wind. I counted. 1,000, 2,003, violent jerk. The chute deployed. A sudden upward yank that rattled my spine, followed by the terrifying silence of the descent. I looked down, swinging in the harness, legs dangling over the apocalypse. The view was a masterpiece of destruction. To my left, the Lincoln Memorial was illuminated not by floodlights, but by a ring of burning Humvees, the white marble stained with soot. To my right, the Washington Monument stood like a dark obelisk, a spear plunged into the heart of a dying city. Below me, the National Mall. It wasn't green grass anymore. It was a shifting, organic sea of gray and red. Thousands of them. The infected. They were a swarm, moving in chaotic patterns, drawn to the sound of the passing aircraft like moths to a bug zapper. I hauled on the risers, steering away from the reflecting pool, which looked more like a mass grave, and aiming for the darker canopy of trees near Constitution Gardens. The ground rushed up to meet me, transforming from a map into a gritty reality of concrete and dirt. I hit the tree line hard. Branches whipped my face, tearing at my exposed skin, snapping like dry bones under my weight. My canopy snagged on a thick oak limb, leaving me dangling 6 feet off the ground, twisting in the wind. "Damn it!" I hissed, the sound of my own voice alien in the sudden quiet. I unclipped the reserve chute, letting it drop, then drew my combat knife. With a grunt of effort, I sliced the risers. I dropped, hitting the earth with a thud, rolling instantly to dissipate the impact, coming up into a crouch, rifle raised, safety off. The smell hit me first. It wasn't just smoke. It was rot. A sweet, cloying, copper-heavy stench of decay that coated the back of my throat like grease. It smelled like a butcher shop left unplugged in the middle of an August heatwave. I scanned the immediate area. A park bench overturned. A crushed Starbucks cup. A torn American flag lying in the mud, boot-printed and bloodied. Symbols of a life that ended. Last Tuesday. I tapped my comms. Alpha 2, this is Bravo 6. On the ground. Sector 4. Over. Static. Just white noise and the ghostly crackle of interference. I tried again. Nothing. The EMP bursts, or just the sheer overload of the grid had killed the comms. I was alone. Movement at my 3 o'clock. Sharp. Jerky. Not human. I pivoted, the barrel of the M4 snapping to the target. It was a man, or what used to be a man. He was wearing a tattered suit, a lobbyist or a lawyer maybe, the remnants of a Brooks Brothers tie hanging loosely around a neck that had been chewed open. His skin was gray, the texture of wet drywall, and his eyes, God, his eyes were milky cataracts of rage. He saw me. A low, guttural sound emanated from his chest, a wet clicking noise like fluid trapped in the lungs. He lunged. No hesitation. No self-preservation. Just hunger. I double-tapped the trigger. The suppressor coughed, asterisk thwip, thwip star. 2 rounds of 5.56 struck him in the chest center mass. He stumbled back, the impact kinetic, but he didn't drop. He rebalanced and came again. The briefing flashed in my mind, asterisk headshots only. Sever the brain stem, asterisk. Understood. I whispered. I adjusted my aim. The third shot took the top of his skull off, misting the oak tree behind him in a fan of dark crimson. He collapsed like a puppet with cut strings. I stood there for a second, breathing hard, the reality of the kill settling in. This wasn't a target downrange in the Middle East. This was an American citizen on American soil. I stepped over the body, my boots crunching on dry leaves and broken glass, and moved toward Constitution Avenue. The street was a graveyard of steel. It looked like rush hour had frozen in time and then rotted. Yellow taxis, black government SUVs, sedans packed with luggage, all abandoned, doors hanging open, windshields shattered. I hugged the line of cars, using the engine blocks for cover, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of a hunter. To my left, a 7-Eleven storefront was gutted, the glass blown out, shelves stripped bare. A looter's paradise. A dead man lay halfway out the window, clutching a 12-pack of Bud Light, his back riddled with buckshot. It was a tableau of the initial panic. I checked the interior of a Ford F-150. Empty, save for a child's car seat in the back and a smear of dried blood on the dashboard. The radio was silent. I kept moving east toward the objective, the Capitol building. The extraction point for the VIP was the rotunda. A suicide. Run. But I had my orders. The silence of the city was the worst part. D.C. was never silent. It was supposed to be filled with sirens, honking, the hum of power. Now, the only sound was the wind, whistling through shattered windows and the distant, rhythmic shuffling of feet. Thousands of feet. I reached the intersection of 17th Street. A barricade of sandbags and police cruisers blocked the road. The D.C. Metro Police had made a stand here. It hadn't worked. Bullet casings carpeted the asphalt, brass glitter under the moonlight. There were bodies everywhere, piled up against the barriers. Officers in riot gear, civilians, and the infected, all tangled in a grotesque embrace of death. I climbed over the hood of a police cruiser, the metal cold under my gloves. Inside, the radio handset dangled by its cord, swaying gently. I dropped to the other side, boots landing in a puddle of something sticky. That's when I heard it. The moan. It started low, a collective vibration in the air, rising in pitch and volume. I looked down the avenue toward the Washington Monument. Through the haze of smoke and fog I saw them. A horde. Not a few stragglers. Hundreds. They were moving out of the darkness of the mall, spilling onto the street, drawn by the scent of the fresh meat that had just fallen from the sky. They were a tide of gray flesh and snapping teeth. Time to move, I gritted out. I broke into a tactical sprint, keeping low, weaving between the gridlocked cars. My breathing was ragged, the weight of the ruck digging into my shoulders. I needed high ground. The street was a death trap. I spotted a scaffold building to my right, some government renovation project left unfinished. I vaulted a Jersey barrier, scrambling toward the construction site. Behind me, the moan turned into a shriek. They had seen me. The sound of running feet, slapping on pavement, erupted. I didn't look back. Looking back gets you killed. I hit the chain-link fence, fingers hooking into the wire, and hauled myself up, vaulting over the razor wire with a grunt of exertion. I landed on a pile of drywall and scrambled for the scaffolding. Ladder. I climbed, hand over hand, the adrenaline surging, my muscles burning. Below, the horde slammed into the fence. The metal groaned and buckled under the weight of hundreds of bodies pushing, clawing, biting at the steel mesh. I reached the second floor, swinging onto the concrete slab, and looked down. The street was disappearing under a carpet of heads. They looked up at me. Hundreds of milky eyes reflecting the moonlight, mouths opening in a unison of hunger. I unclipped a frag grenade from my vest, pulled the pin, and let the spoon fly. "Welcome to D.C.," I muttered, and dropped it into the center of the mass. The explosion was a dull thump, a flash of fire that briefly illuminated the horror, sending bodies flying. It wouldn't stop them, but it bought me seconds. I turned and ran into the darkness of the unfinished building, deeper into the city, deeper into the nightmare. The dust from the grenade blast hadn't even settled before I was moving again, my boots crunching over drywall screws and shattered concrete. The explosion had been a dinner bell. I knew that. In a city of dead politicians and rotting lobbyists, noise was the only currency that mattered, and I just spent a fortune. I sprinted through the skeletal ribs of the unfinished high-rise, the exposed rebar casting long, jagged shadows against the moonlight that filtered through the plastic sheeting. My breath came in ragged hitches, the recycled air of the M50 gas mask tasting like rubber and stale fear. I checked my wrist compass. I needed to head south, toward the mall. Command said the extraction point was the Lincoln Memorial, LZ Alpha. Command was probably dead, or safe in a bunker in Colorado, but orders were the only thing keeping my sanity tethered to reality. I reached the stairwell, a concrete throat leading down into the dark. I took the steps 3 at a time, the weight of my ruck slamming against my spine with every landing. Floor 4. Floor 3. I could hear them below me now, not just the mindless groans of the shamblers, but the wet, slapping sound of flesh hitting concrete. They were breaching the ground floor. I kicked open a fire door on the second level and spilled out onto a mezzanine that overlooked a massive, glass-walled lobby. Or what used to be glass. Now it was just a jagged maw opening onto K Street. Below, it was a mosh pit of hell. The frag had turned a dozen of them into hamburger, but the gap was already filling. The swarm moved like a liquid, a tide of gray skin and business suits. I saw a woman in a shredded Chanel blazer tearing the throat out of a corpse that looked like it had been dead for weeks. They were eating anything. They were eating each other. I unslung my M4. Checking the chamber. Green tip. Good for armor, decent for skulls. I didn't want to shoot, noise discipline was blown, but muzzle flash in a dark building was a beacon, but I needed a path. I spotted a maintenance catwalk suspended above the lobby, leading to a broken window on the far side. It was precarious, swaying slightly from the structural damage of the bombardment days prior. But it was my only ticket out without wading through the meat grinder. I vaulted the railing, landing on the metal grate of the catwalk. It groaned, a screech of tortured metal that cut through the moans below. Every head in the lobby snapped up. Hundreds of milky, cataracts-ridden eyes locked onto me. The sound that rose from them wasn't a roar, it was a hiss, like steam escaping a cracked boiler. They began to climb. They piled over one another, forming a pyramid of bodies, grasping hands reaching for the grate. I sprinted. Fingers brushed the soles of my boots. I saw a man, tie cinched tight, jaw hanging by a tendon, leap with impossible strength, his fingernails scrabbling against the mesh. I stomped, feeling the crunch of bone through my boot sole, sending him tumbling back into the abyss. I hit the window ledge and didn't hesitate. I dove. The air rushed past me, cool and smelling of ozone and rot. I tucked and rolled as I hit the asphalt of K Street, the impact jarring my teeth. I was up instantly, weapon shouldered, sweeping my sector. The street was a graveyard of black SUVs and armored limousines. The evacuation had failed here, hard. Skeletons still sat in the driver's seats of up-armored Suburbans, clutching steering wheels, their skulls resting against spider-webbed windshields. The silence here was heavy, oppressive. The horde back in the building was screaming, but out here, the city felt like it was holding its breath. I moved low, hugging the Jersey barriers that lined the sidewalks. My objective was the metro center. The tunnels. Going overland was suicide. The streets were too exposed, too many sight lines for the snipers, if there were any left, or for the infected to spot a moving silhouette. The tunnels were dangerous, sure, confined spaces, but they bypassed the massive herds that migrated up and down the avenues following the wind. I paused at the corner of 14th, crouching behind a burnt-out hot dog cart. The smell of charred meat was distinct from the rot. It made my stomach cramp. That's when I saw him. Or it. About a block down, standing under the flickering strobe of a dying street lamp, was a figure. He wasn't moving like the others. The infected shuffled, they jerked, they ran with a feral, animalistic gait. This figure stood perfectly still, hands clasped behind his back. He was wearing a tuxedo, tails and all, but it was pristine. No blood. No dust. In a city covered in filth, he was immaculately clean. He was too far to make out facial features. But the posture, it was mocking. He tilted his head to the side, looking directly at my hiding spot. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air punched through my adrenaline. This was the intel report. This was Bert. The guys at Bragg had laughed about the intercepted radio chatter. Survivors talking about creepy Bert, the man who watches, the man who walks through the hordes untouched. We thought it was mass hysteria, a collective hallucination born of trauma. But looking at that silhouette, the geometry of it felt wrong. His arms looked slightly too long for his torso. His head was too large. He raised a hand and waved. A slow, stiff, finger-fluttering wave. Then he pointed down. Toward the metro station entrance. F*CKU. I whispered. my voice sounding tinny inside the mask. I didn't like being herded, but I had no choice. The sound of the horde breaking out of the construction site behind me was getting louder. I broke cover and ran for the metro entrance, boots slapping against the pavement. As I passed the spot where the tuxedoed man had stood, he was gone. There was no place he could have ducked into that quickly. Just empty air and the smell of formaldehyde? Yeah. Formaldehyde and lilacs. It was sickeningly sweet. I slid down the stalled escalator, the ribs of the steps slick with black slime. The station was dark, save for the emergency lights that cast the platform in a sickly orange glow. The vaulted ceiling of the D.C. Metro, with its brittlest concrete squares, looked like the inside of a tomb. Debris was everywhere, suitcases, abandoned strollers, shoes lost in the panic. I vaulted the turnstile, checking corners. Clear. For now. I needed to get to the blue line. Take the tunnel south under the mall, and pop out near the Smithsonian. It was a straight shot, maybe 2 clicks underground. I dropped onto the tracks, the gravel ballast crunching loudly in the acoustic chamber of the tunnel. I clicked on my weapon light, keeping the beam focus low. The tunnel stretched out into infinite blackness. The air down here was stagnant, heavy with the copper tang of old blood. I moved fast, weapon up, scanning the third rail, scanning the shadows. Every 50 meters, I'd stop and listen. Drip. 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 And something else. A scratching sound. Like nails on a chalkboard, echoing from deep in the tunnel ahead. I pushed forward. The scratching grew louder. It wasn't random, it had a rhythm. Asterisk scrape scrape tap. Scrape scrape tap. Asterisk I rounded a gentle curve in the track and froze. In the center of the tunnel, illuminated by the spill of my light, was a blockade. But not of sandbags or concrete. It was bodies. Hundreds of them. Stacked with disturbing precision, interlocking like Lincoln logs to form a wall of flesh floor to ceiling. Arms and legs woven together, heads facing outward. And they weren't all dead. Some of the heads in the wall turned as my light hit them. Eyes blinked. Mouths opened, gnashing silently. It was a living fortification. Jesus Christ! I breathed. I backed up a step. My boot hitting a loose rail tie. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The wall woke up. A collective moan vibrated through the tunnel, shaking dust from the ceiling. Then, the center of the wall began to bulge. Something was pushing from the other side. The bodies tore apart, limbs ripping from sockets, wet tearing sounds filling the air as a massive shape forced its way through the meat. It wasn't Bert. It was a tank, at least that's what the briefing called them. A mass of muscle and tumors, 8 feet tall, skin gray and callous like elephant hide. It roared, a sound that popped my ears, and charged. I didn't think. Training took over. I dropped to a knee and opened up. Pop, 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 controlled bursts. The rounds sparked off the tunnel walls and punched into the creature's chest, blowing out chunks of necrotic flesh. It didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. It was a freight train of rage. I scrambled backward, fumbling for my grenade pouch. I had 1 frag left and a flashbang. I pulled the flashbang. Eat this! I screamed, tossing it under the thing's feet. I squeezed my eyes shut and turned away. Bang! The flash was blinding even through my eyelids, the concussion wave slamming me into the tunnel wall. The creature screamed, a high-pitched shriek of pain. It was disoriented, flailing, smashing into the electrified third rail. Arcs of blue lightning lit up the tunnel, frying the creature's legs. It howled, the smell of burning ozone and cooking meat filling the air. I didn't wait to see if it died. I scrambled up the maintenance ladder on the side of the tunnel, lungs burning. I pushed open the heavy steel grate at the top and spilled out onto grass. Wet, cold grass. I rolled onto my back, gasping, ripping the mask off my face to vomit. The air tasted of smoke and river water. I wiped my mouth and looked up. Above me, looming in the moonlight, was the Washington Monument. But it wasn't white. It was painted. Graffiti? No. I squinted. The bottom third of the obelisk was smeared with red, viscous sludge. And impaled on the flags circling the base, bodies. Dozens of them. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline fading into a dull, aching exhaustion. I was on the mall. It was wide open. A kill zone. To my left, the Capitol building burned, the dome partially collapsed. Flames licking at the night sky. To my right, the Lincoln Memorial, my target. The reflecting pool between them was a black mirror, the water thick and still. I started to run, keeping low, moving from tree to tree along the path. The silence here was worse than the tunnels. It felt watched. As I neared the World War II memorial, I heard the humming. A low, melodic baritone. Asterisk. Oh! Beautiful for spacious skies. Asterisk. The voice drifted across the water. I froze, crouching behind a stone pillar. There, standing at the edge of the pool, was the tuxedo. Bert. He was facing the Lincoln Memorial, conducting an invisible orchestra with jerky, marionette motions. 4 amber waves of grain. He sang, his voice pitch perfect but overlaid with a static distortion. Like a radio struggling for signal. He turned slowly. He was 200 meters away, but I felt his eyes on me. He smiled. The smile was too wide. It split his face, revealing rows of teeth that looked like needles. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers. The water in the reflecting pool erupted. Not with water, but with them. The sleepers. They had been submerged, waiting. Hundreds of infected rose from the muck, silt cascading off their shoulders. They didn't scream. They just turned toward me. Bert bowed, a deep, theatrical bow, and pointed at me again. Run! Soldier boy. His voice echoed in my head, not my ears. The show is just starting. I ran. I sprinted toward the Lincoln Memorial, my legs pumping like pistons. The horde from the pool sloshed onto the pavement, a wet, slapping tide behind me. I could hear them gaining. I reached the base of the memorial. The stairs. So many stairs. I hit the first step, my quads screaming. I fired behind me. Blindly, not aiming, just trying to keep their heads down. I reached the top, collapsing at the feet of Abraham Lincoln. The statue was defaced, the head missing, replaced by a crude, rusted metal spike. I spun around, weapon raised. The horde was halfway up the stairs. I was cornered. I keyed my radio, desperate. Command! This is Viper 2-6. I am at LZ Alpha. Where is the bird? I repeat, where is the bird? Static. Then, a voice cut through. Not command. It was Bert's voice, calm and amused. The birds don't fly this far south anymore, Viper. Welcome to the capital. My capital. I looked out over the mall. The city was moving. Shadows detached themselves from the buildings. The horde on the stairs paused, parting down the middle. Bert walked up the steps, his tuxedo spotless, stepping over the grasping hands of the zombies as if they were favored pets. He stopped 10 steps down, looking up at me with those black, dead eyes. He held out a hand. In his palm sat a single, pristine red apple. Hungry? He asked. I raised my rifle, aiming between his eyes. Go to hell. Bert laughed, a sound like glass breaking in a canyon. We're already there, son. Look around. He swept his hand toward the burning Capitol. Act 2 is my favorite part. It's where the hero realizes there is no cavalry. I pulled the trigger. Click. Jam. My heart stopped. I racked the charging handle. Jammed solid. The casing had stovepiped. I fumbled for my sidearm, my M9. Bert took a step closer. The zombies behind him hissed, anticipating the kill. Suddenly, a roar tore through the sky. Not a monster. Engines. Jet engines. Two A-10 Warthogs screamed over the Lincoln Memorial, so low the vibration rattled my bones. The massive BRRT of the GU-8 Avengers lit up the night, a stream of depleted uranium turning the horde at the bottom of the stairs into mist. Bert looked up, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. Viper 2-6, this is Angel 1. A new voice crackled in my earpiece, thick with a Texan drawl. Sorry we're late. Traffic was a bitch. Pop smoke if you're friendly. 'Cause we're about to turn that staircase into a parking lot. I ripped a red smoke canister from my vest and slammed it against the marble floor. The crimson cloud billowed out, enveloping Lincoln's boots. Smoke is out! I screamed. Danger close! Danger close! Bert looked at me, the smoke swirling around his legs. He didn't look afraid. He looked disappointed. He'd scared. Shaking his head. Intermission, he whispered. Then he stepped backward, seemingly falling off the edge of the stairs, vanishing into the smoke and the horde just as the A-10 swung around for a second pass. The world exploded in noise and fire. I curled into a ball behind the marble pedestal, covering my head as the chain gun tore the world apart. Concrete chips and zombie gore rained down on me. I was alive. For now. But as the jets screamed away and the dust settled, I looked at where Bert had been. The apple was sitting on the step. One bite taken out of it. I grabbed my radio. Angel 1, good effect on target. But we are not clear. I repeat, we are not clear. I stood up, reloading my rifle, my hands shaking. The city was still burning. Bert was still out there. And I had a long way to go before the night was over. This wasn't a rescue mission anymore. It was a hunt. The smell of spent uranium and pulverized marble hung heavy in the humid D.C. air, a metallic taste that coated the back of my throat like copper pennies. My ears were still ringing, a high-pitched whine that masked the wet, slapping sounds of the undead pulling themselves out of the Potomac mud. I stared at the apple. A red delicious. The wax coating caught the flickering light of the burning Humvee down by the reflecting pool. One bite. Perfect teeth. Marks. It wasn't just a snack, it was a calling card. It was a dare. I crushed the fruit under the heel of my combat boot, the pulp mixing with the ash on the granite steps of the Lincoln Memorial. The giant seated statue of Lincoln, shrapnel-scarred and weeping dust from a fresh crack in his forehead, stared blankly past me. I checked my magazine. 20 rounds of 5.56 green tip left in the weapon. 2 spare mags in the carrier. My sidearm was down to 1 clip. I was low on ammo, high on adrenaline, and hunting a puppet from a children's nightmare who seemed to command the armies of hell. Angel 1 to ground actual. I rasped into the radio, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. Target is mobile. Moving east. Advancing on foot towards the Washington Monument. Over. Static. Then, a voice that wasn't command. It was low, nasally, and terrifyingly calm. Water's warm, soldier. I ripped the earpiece out for a second, staring at the radio. The frequency shouldn't have been compromised. I jammed it back in. Command, say again? We didn't copy, Sergeant. Sitrep? Never mind, I muttered. I adjusted my night vision goggles, flipping the monocular down. The world turned into a grainy, green phosphor chaos. The heat signatures of the A-10 strike were cooling, but the bodies were lighting up again. Not with body heat, they were cold, but with the friction of movement. The horde at the base of the stairs was broken, mangled by the GU-8 Avengers run, but the stragglers were already reforming. They didn't moan. That was the worst part about the DC strain. They were silent. The only sound was the wet slap of bare feet on pavement, and the grinding of teeth. I moved. I didn't run, running triggers the chase. Instinct. I moved with a predator's gait, low and rhythmic, sliding down the side of the monument's base, bypassing the main staircase where the bulk of the meat grinder was twitching. I hit the grass of the mall and instantly sank to my ankles in mud. The irrigation systems had blown days ago, turning the National Mall into a swamp. To my left, the reflecting pool was a mass grave. In the green glow of the NVGs, I saw shapes rippling under the surface. Bloated tourists, soldiers who didn't make the extraction, politicians, lobbyists. Death was the great equalizer. And right now, they were all just bobbing obstacles. I stuck to the tree-line on the south side, using the thick trunks of the cherry blossoms for cover. The trees were shredded, branches hanging like broken limbs, stripped of their famous pink flowers. Movement at 12 o'clock. I froze, bringing the M4 up. A silhouette stood by the World War II memorial. It was too tall to be Bert. Too broad. It was a riot cop, helmet visor shattered, tactical vest hanging by a thread. He was swaying. I whistled low, a mistake, but I needed to know. The head snapped toward me with bone cracking. Speed. He charged. I dropped him with a double tap to the chest and one to the cranium. The suppressed shots were barely whispers, but the brass casing hitting the pavement sounded like a church bell in the silence. The body slumped. I stepped over him, keeping my eyes on the pillars of the World War II memorial. The Atlantic and Pacific arches loomed like gateways to the underworld. And there he was. Just for a second. Standing inside the dried-out fountain of the memorial, framed by the bronze eagles. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the sky, tracing the contrails of the retreating jets. That yellow skin, textured like felt but hardened like callus. The vertical striped sweater, stained with oil and blood. He looked bored. "Bert!" I screamed. Breaking protocol. The anger bubbled up, overriding the fear. "Face me, you freak!" He turned slowly. Even from 50 yards away, I saw the unibrow fro. He raised a hand, not in a wave, but pointing behind me. I spun around. The Korean War Veterans Memorial. The stainless steel statues of the platoon walking through the rice paddies. In the dark, they always looked ghostly. But now, they were moving. No, they weren't moving. Things were moving among them. Figures rose from the brush behind the steel soldiers. They wore tattered fatigues. Helmets from a different war, rotted flesh clinging to ancient bone. It was impossible. The D.C. infection reanimated the fresh dead, not the long dead. But Bert changed the rules. He wasn't just leading zombies, he was curating a museum of horror. I scrambled back, firing blindly into the brush. The shapes kept coming, shambling through the steel platoon, merging history with the present nightmare. I turned and sprinted toward the empty fountain of the World War II memorial, vaulting the granite wall. I landed in the center, scanning for Bert. Gone. Again. But in the center of the fountain, arranged carefully on the bronze plating, was a pigeon. Its neck was snapped, head twisted 180 degrees. Beside it, a single paper clip. Psychological warfare. I muttered, wiping sweat from my eyes. He's playing with his food. I needed to get off the mall. It was a kill box. The open ground was suicide. I checked my map. The nearest hard cover was the Smithsonian Metro entrance, or the bureaucracy canyons of the Federal Triangle. I chose the tunnels. The metro was dangerous, a labyrinth of electrified rails and darkness, but the horde was surface side. The A-10s had drawn every biter in a 5-mile radius to the monuments. The underground might be my only flank. I sprinted across 17th Street, dodging abandoned sedans and a jackknifed metro bus. I reached the kiosk entrance, vaulting the gate. The escalator was a jagged slide of broken metal and debris. I slid down, boots grinding against the metal teeth, descending into the throat of the city. The air temperature dropped 20 degrees. The smell changed from cordite to mildew and ozone. The station was pitch black. My NVGs whined softly. I was in the Smithsonian station. The vaulted waffle ceiling, usually an architectural marvel, looked like the inside of a tomb. I moved to the platform edge. The third rail was dead, but I wasn't taking chances. I stayed on the concrete. Asterisk click. 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 Asterisk. The sound echoed from the tunnel leading toward Federal Triangle. It wasn't footsteps. It was the sound of hard plastic tapping on tile. I took cover behind a concrete pillar, leveling my rifle. Asterisk click. 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 Asterisk. A rubber duck rolled out of the darkness. A standard, yellow rubber duck. It rolled to a stop in the center of the platform, staring at me with painted black eyes. I stared at it, my breathing shallow. It squeaked. Once. On its own. "This isn't real," I whispered. "Carbon monoxide. Stress. Fatigue. Oh, it's real." "Neighbor." The voice echoed from the tunnel. It wasn't on the radio this time. It was acoustic, bouncing off the tiled walls. "Do you know what the letter of the day is?" I fired a burst into the darkness. Muzzle flash illuminated the tunnel for a millisecond. I saw them. Hundreds of them. Not zombies. Mannequins. They were standing in the tunnel, shoulder to shoulder. Naked, plastic. Featureless mannequins from the department stores downtown. But they were arranged in a phalanx, blocking the track. And behind them, standing on the maintenance walkway, was Bert. He was holding a flashlight under his chin, illuminating that long, yellow face, casting grotesque shadows that stretched to the ceiling. "The letter of the day," he intoned, his voice dropping an octave, becoming guttural, demonic, "is D. For death." The mannequins surged forward. They didn't walk, they were pushed. A wave of ghouls poured from behind them, using the plastic bodies as shields. The sheer mass of it was overwhelming. I turned and ran. I sprinted toward the opposite tunnel, heading for L'Enfant Plaza. I didn't look back. I could hear the clatter of plastic and the wet slap of flesh behind me. I hurdled a turnstile, my kit bag slamming against my spine. I hit the stairs up to Independence Avenue, lungs burning. I burst out onto the street level, gasping for air. The night sky was choked with smoke. I was south of the mall now. The Smithsonian Castle loomed to my left, its red sandstone looking like dried blood in the NVGs. I needed high ground. The Washington Monument was the highest point, but it was a lightning rod for the dead. The Capitol? Too far. The White House. Command had said the extraction was at the ellipse south of the White House. But that was 2 hours ago. Before the A-10s. Before Bert. I checked my radio again. "Angel 1 to anyone. I am at Independence and 12th. I am moving north. I am pursued. Over. Sergeant." The voice of my CO crackled through, weak and distorted. "Angel 1, fall back, trap. The ellipse is compromised. Do not, repeat, do not go to the White House." "Where then?" "Give me a grid." "Roof." "The old post office." "Trump International, Tower." The signal died. The old post office tower. It was one of the highest structures in the city. A sniper's nest. A fortress. I looked north. I could see the tower rising above the smoke, a dark needle against the burning clouds. To get there, I had to cross the mall again. I reloaded on the move, swapping my nearly empty mag for a fresh one. I had 60 rounds left. Total. I cut through the Hirshhorn sculpture garden. The modern art statues looked like twisted demons in the dark. I navigated the maze of concrete and bronze, every shadow a potential ambush. As I reached the edge of the garden, facing the mall, the ground shook. Boom. Boom. Footsteps? No. Impacts. I looked toward the Capitol building. The dome was illuminated by fires burning in the rotunda. And walking down the center of the mall, silhouetted against the burning Capitol, was something massive. It wasn't a giant monster. It was a float. A Macy's Day Parade float. It was Big Bird. Rotting, yellow feathers hanging in clumps. One eye missing, the other a gaping hole of darkness. The float was deflated, sagging, draped over the chassis of a heavy tactical truck like a necrotic skin. But it wasn't being driven. It was being pulled. Hundreds of zombies were harnessed to the front of the truck with chains and electrical cords, dragging the massive, horrific effigy down the gravel path. And sitting on top of the Big Bird float, legs crossed, peeling another apple, was Bert. He saw me. I know he saw me. He didn't point this time. He just tilted his head. The zombies dragging the float stopped. They all turned in unison. 500 heads snapping toward the sculpture garden. Run! I told myself. I broke cover, sprinting across Madison Drive, heading for the Museum of Natural History. I needed to cut through the building to get to the Federal Triangle. I shot the glass out of the ground floor window and dove through, rolling across the marble floor of the atrium. The famous elephant in the rotunda greeted me. I scrambled to my feet. Glass shards embedded in my tactical vest. I could hear them crashing through the doors behind me. The swarm was breaching. I ran past the dinosaur exhibits, the T-Rex skeleton looming overhead. Shadows danced on the walls. I didn't have time to admire the exhibits. I found the service stairwell and kicked the door open, taking the stairs 2 at a time. 2nd floor. 3rd floor. Roof. Access. I burst onto the roof of the museum. The cool night air hit me. I was high up, but not high enough. The old post office tower was across Constitution Avenue, a block away. But the street below was a river of flesh. Thousands of them. I looked at the gap. The museum roof. The IRS building across the street. A 20-foot drop, 30-foot gap. Impossible. But there was a construction crane. A tower crane stationed on Constitution Avenue, its boom arm resting near the museum roof, the counterweight swinging near the IRS building. I climbed the parapet. The horde was spilling onto the roof behind me. I could hear their nails scrabbling on the ventilation ducts. I sprinted along the edge of the roof and leaped for the crane's lattice structure. My gloves gripped the cold steel. The impact wrenched my shoulder, screaming in agony. I dangled 80 feet above the zombie-flooded street. I pulled myself up, boots scrambling for purchase. I traversed the crane arm, balancing on the steel beam like a tightrope walker. Below me, the city was a map of destruction. The White House was dark, save for a few emergency strobes. The Washington Monument stood like a tombstone. Halfway across the crane, the operator's cab swiveled. Crane operators don't swivel on their own. I froze. Inside the glass cab, illuminated by the dashboard lights, sat a figure. Ernie. Or what was left of him. His orange sweater was shredded. His hair was a wild, matted mess. His jaw was hanging loose, unhinged. He wasn't controlling the crane. He was dead. But his hand was taped to the joystick. And standing behind him, in the shadows of the cab, was Bert. Bert leaned forward and pushed Ernie's dead hand. The joystick moved forward. The crane lurched. The boom arm dipped. I lost my footing. I slid down the steel beam, sparks flying from my knee pads. I grabbed a cross brace at the last second, swinging wildly. The crane was swinging toward the Federal Triangle, but also dipping lower, toward the horde. Going down? Bert's voice came over the construction site. Loudspeaker, distorted and screeching. I swung my body, building momentum. I had to time the release. The IRS building roof was coming up fast. 1, 2, 3. I let go. I flew through the air, flailing. I hit the gravel roof of the IRS building, rolling, tumbling, slamming into an HVAC unit. The wind was knocked out of me. I lay there, gasping, staring up at the stars. The crane swung back. I saw Bert in the cab, looking down. He gave a slow, deliberate thumbs down. I forced myself up. My ribs felt cracked. My left arm was numb. But I was across. The old post office tower was directly ahead, attached to the building I was on. I limped toward the tower access door. It was locked. I fired 2 rounds into the lock mechanism and kicked it open. Stairs. Endless stairs. I climbed. My legs burned. My lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. Floor 5. Floor 6. Floor 7. I reached the observation deck level. The bells. The bells of Congress. I pushed the final door open and stumbled out onto the observation deck. The wind was howling up here. 300 feet in the air. Angel 1 to command! I'm at the tower! Where is the bird? Where is the extraction? Silence. Then, the sound of rotors. I looked north. A Black Hawk helicopter was approaching, running dark. No lights. Just the rhythmic thwump 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 of the blades. Angel 1, this is dust off. We see your IR strobe. Hold fast. We are coming in for a hover extraction. You have 30 seconds. I ripped the IR strobe from my Velcro patch and activated it, holding it high. I see you, dust off. Hurry. The chopper flared, the wash kicking up dust and debris. The side door slid open. A crew chief leaned out, waving me forward. The winch cable began to lower. I moved toward the railing. Salvation. And then I saw the pilot. The cockpit was illuminated by the dashboard glow. The pilot was wearing a flight helmet, visor up. It was a Muppet. Blue fur. Googly eyes. Grover. He looked at me, a sad, panicked expression on his fuzzy face. He mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," from the cargo bay. Behind the crew chief, a hand emerged. A yellow hand? It grabbed the crew chief by the vest and yanked him back into the shadows of the fuselage. The crew chief screamed, a sound that was cut short by the wet crunch of bone. Bert stepped into the doorway of the hovering helicopter. The wind whipped his vertical stripes. He looked at me, standing on the tower, and he looked at the cable dangling between us. He pulled a knife. A large, serrated combat knife. Near! Bert shouted over the rotor wash, pointing to himself. He slashed the winch cable. Far! He whispered, pointing at me. The cable fell, snake-like, clattering onto the observation deck. The helicopter banked hard to the left, Grover fighting the controls as Bert disappeared back into the dark. Fuselage. The Black Hawk spun away, disappearing into the smoke over the Potomac. I stood there, alone on the tower. The highest point in the city. The city burning below me. You want to hunt? I screamed at the retreating chopper, my voice breaking. You want a game? Fine. I dropped my empty magazine and slammed the last fresh one home. I racked the charging handle. I'm not the rescue anymore, I growled, turning back to the stairwell door, where the sound of slow, rhythmic footsteps was already echoing up from the darkness below. I'm the hazard. I didn't wait for them to breach. I kicked the door open and raised my rifle, stepping into the dark. End of Act 3. The darkness inside the Washington Monument wasn't empty, it was heavy. It had a weight to it. Pressing against my retinas, smelling of copper and 3-day-old meat. The stairwell was a narrow throat of industrial steel and concrete, a vertical coffin stretching 555 feet down into the belly of a dead nation. I didn't just walk down. I descended like a piston. The first one came at the landing of the 500-foot level. A park ranger, his smoky bear hat trampled flat against the grating, his jaw unhinged like a snake's. He didn't groan, The dead in D.C. didn't have the breath for it. He just clicked, teeth snapping together with the wet sound of polished bone. I didn't hesitate. The carbine snapped up, the holographic sight blooming red in the gloom. Crack, crack, 2 rounds. Center mass, then head. Controlled, rhythmic, American efficiency. The ranger folded, sliding down the steps in a tangle of limbs, but the noise, God, the noise, was the real weapon. In this concrete silo, the gunshot was a physical blow. It hammered my eardrums. But more importantly, it rang the dinner bell. From below, a sound rose up to meet me. Not a roar, but a dry, rustling friction. Like dry leaves dragging over pavement. Thousands of feet. Shuffling. Climbing. Come get it, I whispered, the vibration buzzing in my teeth. I took the stairs 3 at a time, gravity acting as my partner. At the 480-foot landing, a cluster of tourists blocked the way. A family, maybe? Mom, Dad, 2 kids and I, hard DC shirts that were now stiff with dried burgundy. They looked up as one, their eyes clouded with cataracts of rot. The father lunged. I drove the muzzle into his sternum, firing point blank. The recoil jarred my shoulder, blowing him backward into the others, creating a stumbling domino effect of gore. I vaulted the railing. Dropping 10 feet to the next landing, my boots crunching on something soft. It was a grind. A meat grinder, and I was the crank. 400 feet. 350. The air grew hotter, thicker. The ventilation was dead, and the humidity of the swamp city was trapped in here with the smell of the deceased. I swapped mags at 300 feet, the empty polymer casing clattering down the central shaft, pinging off steel. Girders like a coin dropped in a wishing well. I wished for a grenade. I wished for Bert's throat in my hand. Bert. That giggling psychopath. He hadn't just left me, he'd curated this. He knew the extraction was a lie. He wanted to see if the American soldier was still the apex predator when you stripped away the air support, the comms, and the hope. He was probably watching thermal feeds right now, eating popcorn in that Black Hawk. Are you not entertained? I shouted down the shaft, my voice cracking with hysteria and rage. Is this visceral enough for you, Bert? A hand shot through the railing gap, grabbing my ankle. Grip like a vice. I looked down. A lobbyist in a shredded Armani suit, his tie caught in the open wound of his throat. I stomped, shattering the radius and ulna, feeling the bone give way through the sole of my combat boot. He fell back, but there were more behind him. The stairwell was clogging. The fluid dynamics of the dead. They filled the space available. I switched to semi-auto. Conservation was key. Pop, 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 each shot a sentence. Each kill a punctuation mark. My world narrowed to the illuminated cone of my weapon light. Flash of teeth. Flash of gray skin. Flash of blood spray. Step, fire, pivot, drop. Step, fire, pivot, drop. 200 feet. The heat was suffocating. My uniform was plastered to my skin. Sweat stinging the cuts on my face. My lungs burned like I was inhaling glass. I was running out of room. They were thick here, a wall of bodies pressing up the stairs. I couldn't shoot them all. Physics was against me. I looked at the central elevator shaft. The car was stuck somewhere above. The cables hung like vines in a jungle. Hazard, I reminded myself. Be the hazard. I slung the rifle tight to my chest, grabbed the greasy steel cable of the elevator shaft, and jumped. Leather gloves smoked against the wire. I plummeted through the dark, the wind rushing past. My ears, the moans of the stairwell fading into a blurred Doppler effect. I squeezed tight, braking hard, my boots skidding against the guide rails, sparks showering down into the abyss. I hit the roof of the elevator car at the bottom with a bone-jarring crash that knocked the wind out of me. I rolled, gasping, coughing up bile. The elevator hatch was open. I dropped inside the car, then pried the doors apart. The lobby. Ground zero. Sunlight, harsh and blinding, filtered through the blast-proof glass doors. The lobby was a slaughterhouse. Bodies stacked like cordwood against the security checkpoints. But the motion was everywhere. The National Mall wasn't just infested, it was an ocean. I checked my ammo. 1 full mag. 1 in the weapon. A combat knife. A flare gun I'd lifted from the pilot's survival kit before Bert went crazy. I kicked the glass doors. The safety glass spiderwebbed but didn't break. I kicked again. Screaming with the effort, channeling every ounce of hate I had for Grover, for Bert, for this godforsaken city. The glass shattered, raining diamonds onto the pavement. The heat of Washington, D.C. hit me like a physical slap. 90 degrees, 100% humidity. The sound of cicadas buzzing in the trees mixed with the low-frequency groan of 10,000 dead throats. I stepped out onto the flags. The Washington Monument pierced the sky behind me, a tombstone for the history I was leaving behind. Ahead lay the reflecting pool, now a basin of black sludge and floating debris. Beyond that, the Lincoln Memorial. And between me and Lincoln? The horde. They turned. It was a slow, ripple effect, like wind moving through a wheat field, if the wheat was made of rotting flesh. Hundreds of heads snapped toward the sound of the breaking glass. I didn't run. You don't run from a predator, it triggers the chase instinct. Even the dead have instincts. I walked. I brought the rifle up, stock tight in the shoulder pocket, both eyes open. U.S. Army! I bellowed, the command voice drilled into me at Benning, tearing through the humid air. Make a hole! Surprisingly, or perhaps terrifiedly, the front ranks hesitated. Maybe it was the pheromones of pure aggression. Maybe it was the uniform. Or maybe I just looked like death itself. I opened. Fire. I cut a lane. Controlled bursts. I moved toward the World War II memorial, using the fountains as choke points. The water was red, clogged with bodies, but the granite barriers gave me cover. I vaulted a parapet, landing in the water, the cool sludge soaking my boots. A zombie in a tour guide uniform splashed toward me. I smashed the butt of the rifle into his face, hearing the crunch of cartilage, and drove the bayonet lug into his eye socket. I scrambled up the other side, dripping, shivering despite the heat. That's when I saw the drone. A small, quadrotor commercial drone. Buzzing like an angry hornet 20 feet above my head. It had a camera slung under its belly. It dipped its nose, hovering, watching. Bert! I spat, blood and spit landing on the marble of the Atlantic Triumphal Arch. The drone wagged left and right, then buzzed forward, leading the way. Leading me toward the Lincoln Memorial. You want a finale? I growled, racking a fresh round. I'll give you a finale. I ran. The fatigue in my legs vanished, replaced by the cold burn of adrenaline. I sprinted along the side of the reflecting pool, the gravel crunching under my boots. The horde was closing in from the tree lines, from the Constitution Gardens, from the Ash Road. A pincer movement of the undead. I reached the base of the Lincoln Memorial steps. The great white temple rose above me, pristine and indifferent. But the steps were a carpet of the dead. I was out of ammo. The bolt locked back on an empty chamber. I let the rifle drop on its sling. Drawing the combat knife, 8 inches of serrated high-carbon steel. Come on! I screamed at the drone, which was now hovering at a level with the statue of Lincoln deep inside the chamber. I started climbing. Hand to hand. Knife to throat. Boot to chest. It was primal. It was ugly. I gutted a jogger in spandex. I severed the spine of a Capitol Police officer. I was covered in black ichor, slipping on the gore, clawing my way up the marble stairs of American history. I reached the top. The sanctuary. Lincoln sat there, massive and white, staring out over the ruin of his Union. And at his feet, sitting casually on the base of the statue, was a radio. An old-school, heavy-duty military brick. It was crackling. I limped toward it, my breath coming in ragged. Wet gasps. The drone hovered right above it. I keyed the mic, my hand trembling, slick with blood. "Bert," I wheezed. Static. Then that voice. Smooth, calm, like he was ordering a latte. Asterisk Act 4, Scene 1, asterisk. Bert's voice drifted from the speaker. Asterisk the hero ascends. The hero realizes he is alone. How does it feel, sport? Does it feel like freedom? Asterisk. I looked out past the columns. The horde was climbing the stairs. Thousands of them. A sea of grasping hands. I was trapped. Back to the wall. Lincoln at my back. "You left me to die," I said, watching the first of the dead crest the top step. Asterisk no, asterisk, Bert corrected. Asterisk I left you to live. Really live. The rescue was a crutch. The helicopter was a cage. Now you're the monument. Look under the radio. Asterisk. I kicked the radio aside. Underneath lay a detonator. A clacker. The wires ran trailing off behind Lincoln's chair, disappearing into the utility tunnels. Asterisk the mall is rigged, asterisk, Bert said. His voice giddy. Asterisk Grover and I spent all morning on it. Claymores. Daisy chained along the reflecting pool. C4 on the bridge supports. You want to clear the board? You want to win the game? Asterisk. The dead were 20 feet away. I could smell their rot. I could see the hunger in their milky eyes. I picked up the clacker. It was heavy. Real. Asterisk do it, asterisk. Bert whispered. Asterisk become the hazard, asterisk. I looked at the drone. I looked at the oncoming tide of death. I looked at the detonator in my hand. This isn't your game, Bert, I said, my voice dropping an octave, settling into a cold, hard resolve. This is my war. I didn't squeeze the clacker. Not yet. I turned and ran toward the horde. Bert screamed over the radio. Asterisk wait! That's not the script, asterisk. I hit the line. Of zombies like a linebacker, my knife flashing. I wasn't fighting them. I was using them. I carved a path through the center, throwing bodies off the steps, creating a chaotic avalanche of flesh. I surfed the chaos down the stairs, riding the collapsing wave of the undead back toward the reflecting pool. I hit the gravel at the bottom, surrounded, suffocated, buried in the noise. Asterisk now. Asterisk. I squeezed the clacker. Boom. The world turned white. The claymores lining the reflecting pool detonated in a synchronized ripple of thunder. A wall of water, mud, and shrapnel erupted. Skyward, a tsunami of destruction tearing through the horde on both flanks. The concussive wave knocked me flat, blowing the air out of my lungs, shattering the eardrums of every creature within a mile. The shockwave cleared them all. It was a corridor of smoke and mist. I lay on my back, staring up at the smoke-choked sky. The drone was gone, swatted out of the air by the blast. Silence returned, ringing and high-pitched. I sat up. The horde was decimated. Broken bodies littered the landscape like fallen leaves. The path to the Potomac was open. I stood up, swaying. I was battered, bleeding, deafened, and alone. But I was standing. I walked to the edge of the Potomac River. The water was dark, swirling with the current. Far off, in the distance, I saw the black speck of the helicopter hovering, watching from a safe distance. I raised my knife, pointing it at the chopper. A promise. Then I turned south. Away from the city. Away from the monuments. Into the deep woods of Virginia. End of Act 4. I whispered to no one. The credits were rolling, but I wasn't done. The paratrooper was gone. The survivor was gone. The hazard was loose in America. And he was coming for the director.